Hi everyone, welcome to Film Summaries. Today we'll be recapping the mystery thriller Shutter Island. This story is one of the genre's greatest masterpieces. With its intricate plot, its brilliant use of imagery, symbolism, and its mind-blowing twists and turns that constantly has its viewers guessing. And of course, spoilers ahead. Let's begin. The movie sets the scene with a thick veil of mist coating the sea as a murky silhouette of a boat emerges. Inside the boat, we meet Deputy Marshal Edward Daniels, finding himself with a bad case of seasickness. He looks into a mirror and tells himself to pull it together. On the deck of the boat, he meets his new partner Chuck. The two men make small talk, and Chuck asks him if he's married. He answers that his wife died from a fire, with the scene flashing to a memory of his wife Dolores. Chuck apologizes and offers one of his cigarettes. They start talking about their case. Their destination is a remote island that houses criminally insane patients. The island looms from the horizon in an ominous way. The captain of the ship tells Teddy and Chuck that the harbor ahead is the only way in or out of the island. The boat docks and the two officers meet Deputy Warden McPherson, who welcomes them, but are met with intense glares from the guards. Teddy comments that his guards seem a little on edge, with the warden replying, "Right now, Marshal, we all are." The two travel with the warden into the main facility, taking note that the whole institute resembles something of a prison camp. The warden explains that due to protocol, the officers will be required to surrender their firearms. Teddy protests that federal appointed marshals must carry firearms at all times, but the warden replies that executive order also states that when inside a mental facility, the officers of that institution have final authority, leaving the officers no choice but to give up their guns. After entering, the warden gives the officers a brief tour of the facility, especially pointing out the infamous Ward C, where the most dangerous patients are kept. During the tour, the officers notice something strange about the behaviors of the patients, in particular a lady with bloodshot eyes that make an eerie gesture as if to keep quiet. The officers meet Dr. Corley, who introduces himself and the work they do. According to the doctor, the institute currently houses 66 patients, and that the place was built to cure them, but if unsuccessful, provide a calm and comfortable life to them at the very least. Teddy points out that all the patients here are murderers, and questions whether they deserve comfort, and the doctor gives him a concerned look. The doctor explains that the case revolves around an escaped patient, Rachel Solando, who reportedly drowned all three of her children, set them around the kitchen table, and then insisted that her children weren't dead. Upon seeing Rachel's photos, Teddy has a sharp flashback of a young woman and her daughter frozen to death by some train tracks. The officers are taken to Rachel's room, and upon search, Chuck takes note that the patient's shoes are still present, so she can't have gone far. Teddy finds a hidden note underneath the floorboards of her bed. The doctor notes that this is definitely Rachel's handwriting, and that although she was delusional, she was intelligent. Joining the warden's search outside, Teddy spots some caves and asks if they have checked there, but the warden quickly dismisses the idea, saying that it's impossible to get to. As Teddy questions the staff, they note that during the night of the escape, Rachel had therapy with her primary care psychiatrist, Dr. Sheehan, who is now on vacation and could not be reached due to the raging storm. That evening, Corley invites Teddy and Chuck into his office for a drink. Upon hearing a vinyl record that is playing, Teddy is struck by visions of prisoners in the snow. Teddy notes that this was a piece by Mahler. An old man beside the fireplace praises Teddy's answer, and Corley introduces him as his colleague, Dr. Neri. Something about Nering's accent starts flooding Teddy's mind with images, so Nering assumes that the two have both served in the war. Teddy recalls a scene where he was standing over a dying German soldier in an office with the same Mahler piece playing. The man desperately reaches for his gun, begging for mercy, but Teddy cruelly denies him, leaving him to die a slow and painful death. Teddy then demands for Dr. Sheehan and the rest of the staff's files. When Dr. Nering refuses to give the files, Teddy furiously bangs on the table, and Corley explains that he had already requested this to the board, but they had refused. Teddy then angrily states that this investigation is over. During the night, Teddy dreams about his wife in their flowery green apartment, asking him if he's been drinking. Her expression suddenly changes and tells him that he can't leave. As she slowly dissolves into ashes, she also says to him that she is here, and so is he. And when Teddy asks who, she tells him Andrew Ladis, and he can't leave until he finds them. Her body crumbles with the apartment, but strangely she leaves a trail of water. The next morning, Teddy demands that he questions some of the patients in the same group session as Rachel. During the interview, Mrs. Keynes uncomfortably shifts her eyes between Teddy and Chuck. Mrs. Keynes then asks for a glass of water, and Chuck offers to get it. With his back turned, Mrs. Keynes grabs Teddy's notebook and scribbles something on it. Lastly, Teddy asks her who Andrew Lattice is, and she chokes up saying that she's never heard of him. Later, Teddy notes that Mrs. Keynes was coached into her responses. Confirming Teddy's suspicions that Corley is hiding something, Chuck asks Teddy who Lattice is, and Teddy tells him he was the maintenance man from the building they lived in, and was the one that lit the match that would ultimately cause the fire to the building. He revealed that he requested to be in the investigation in order to confront Lattice. Later that day, the officers search the island, and Teddy reveals what Mrs. Keynes scribbled in his notebook. Run. Suddenly, the storm rages even stronger, forcing the officers into the nearest Molosseum for shelter. There, Teddy recounts his experiences in the war. After the surrender of the German soldiers, the Allied soldiers saw the bodies of the women and children frozen in snow. Enraged, his troops lined up the German soldiers and shot them all. He then tells Chuck that he thinks the island is being used for human experiments in the same way as the Nazis, with the mental hospital being used as a front. Chuck theorizes that the government might have set him up for this case, faked an investigation case, and now they're both trapped. Right as he says this, the doors blast open, with the warden on speakerphone saying that they both need to come with him and they know that they're in there. As the two return to Corley's office to a meeting, the board is discussing the flooding and how the emergency mechanism will release all the patients from their cells. While Dr. Nearing insists that the patients from Ward C to be restrained as they are dangerous, Corley insists that they must not do so because the patients might drown. The two are surprised to find that Rachel has already been found. As the detectives question her, Rachel says that she believes she is still in her house and her children are at school. After Teddy asks her where she was yesterday, Rachel has a breakdown, confusing Teddy with her dead husband. After the interview, they retreat to Corley's office, when Teddy suddenly experiences a severe migraine, with the doctor immediately offering him aspirin. Because of the excruciating pain, he was led to the hospital. He begins to have severe hallucinations, where he retraces the streets of the concentration camps where the bodies were piled up. He sees the young girl clutching her mother again, but as he approaches, the corpse becomes Rachel and her young daughter. The young girl wakes up and says to him that he should have saved her. He then finds himself in Corley's office, where he finds Rachel standing next to the corpse of her 3 dead children. He picks the girl up, and the girl asks him why he didn't save her. Teddy starts apologizing, saying that he was too late. He takes the girl to a lake where Rachel stands next to him. He suddenly wakes up and sees his wife enter the room. She tells him that Lattice is on the island and that he needs to kill him. A bolt of lightning fills the room with a white bright light, and Teddy is startled awake from his dreams. Chuck greets him saying that the backup generators have failed, island is in chaos, and several inmates have escaped. Chuck then suggests that they visit Ward C, where Andrew Lattice might be in. As they travel the ward, Teddy gets attacked by one of the escaped patients, but he manages to overpower the patient and starts violently beating him and choking him. Chuck arrives just on time to stop Teddy from choking the patient any further. As Chuck helps the patient into the infirmary, Teddy ventures deeper into the ward. Amidst the eerie patients, Teddy encounters a familiar man sobbing behind his cell. Revealed to be George Noyce, someone that Teddy knew. Noyce points out that all the scars on his face was done by Teddy, and tells him that this is all a game and he was just a rat in a maze. Teddy promises that he will get George out of here, but George ignores him and asks whether he's been alone during his time here. Teddy mentions his partner, and George knowingly says that Teddy's never worked with him before. Teddy reasons that he trusts Chuck, with George replying that if that's the case, they've already won. He then explains that the lighthouse is where they take patients to lobotomize them. Teddy promises that George isn't going to go there, but George snaps at him, asserting that he can't uncover the truth and kill Lattice at the same time, and that he has to make a choice. He must let go of her. At that moment, Dolores appears in the cell, reminding him of the day that her heart was breaking, and Teddy asks her why. All the while, George pleads for him to let her go, and that she is messing with his head. She is going to kill you. Teddy yells that he can't, and leaves George to his cell. Afterwards, Teddy begins to suspect Chuck, and asks him where he was. Chuck explains that he took a detour and found the intake forms of Andrew Lattice, who was patient 67. Advancing towards the lighthouse, Chuck pleads Teddy not to continue, as they should question the hospital on the patient that they were covering up. Teddy insists on pushing onwards, leaving Chuck behind. Realizing the lighthouse will be too difficult to get to, Teddy doubles back to join his partner, only to find him missing. Following a cigarette trail, he spots the body of a dead man at the bottom of a cliff. Teddy makes the difficult descent down, only to discover that there was nothing there. Behind him, Teddy sees a horde of rats. Pushing through, he spots a cave with a glowing light inside, and a woman in her late 40s reveals that she's the real Rachel Solano. She was a former psychiatrist here, but that was until she started questioning the shipments of psychotropic drugs, and that there was no way to get off the island. She explains that the island is used to run illegal and inhumane brain experiments, and that Teddy must have been drugged since he's been experiencing vivid hallucinations, suddenly remembering the aspirin he got from the doctor. The next morning, Teddy is told to leave, and Rachel explains that she will change her hiding spot. Eventually, Teddy is found by the warden and is taken back to the buildings. He sees Carly come out of a meeting with some of the staff and patients. Dr. Carly explains that the meeting was about an unidentified patient that made his way towards Ward C and hurt a patient there. This patient had a long conversation with a paranoid schizophrenic George Noyce. He goes on to explain that 2 weeks ago, one of the patients got so wound up by one of Noyce's stories that the patients beat Noyce up. They then talk about Teddy's trip back home, considering that the investigation is over. Teddy then asks where Chuck is, and to Teddy's surprise, Carly seems confused about his partner's existence, and that he came here alone. Teddy attempts to sneak out of the building when he runs into Dr. Naring. He sees the doctor going for a needle in his pocket, so he wrestles him and uses the needle on him instead. Teddy runs to light a car on fire to create a distraction, and Dolores appears, telling him to go to the ferry. But Teddy insists that he must save his partner, who is being held at the lighthouse. As the car explodes, he sees Dolores holding hands with a little girl. She is pale and seemingly drenched in water. As the guards are distracted, Teddy swims his way across to the lighthouse. Upon reaching shore, he knocks out a scared-looking lifeguard, takes his gun and walks up a spiral staircase, clearing each room one by one to find them empty. Upon reaching the top floor, he finds Dr. Coley sitting calmly in his chair. After frantically searching the room, Coley tells him that the rifle is empty and asks him how badly did he hurt the guard downstairs. Teddy replies that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Dr. Coley speaks into a phone, saying, "Yes, he is here. Have Dr. Sheehan check up on the guard before he makes his way up." Coley looks at Teddy calmly but sternly and tells him that he blew up his car, and that he had really loved that car. He notes that Teddy's tremors are getting worse and asks him how his hallucinations are doing. Dolores briefly appears, pleading Teddy to get out of there, and that this place will be the end of him. Teddy snaps that he had found Dr. Solando and she had told him everything. He says that he found her in one of the caves by the cliffs and they will never get to her. Coley calmly says that he doesn't doubt that, considering that she is not real. Coley then explains that he's not under the influence of anything. When Teddy asks about the tremors, Coley explains that it's withdrawal from chlorpromazine, medicine for schizophrenic patients, which they have been giving him for the past 24 months. Coley explains that Teddy has been a patient in the institute for the past 2 years, and he's been plagued with severe delusions. Teddy refuses to believe this, so Coley hands Teddy the form for the 67th patient his partner has found that he hasn't read yet. Teddy begins reading the form. Patient is highly intelligent, highly delusional decorated Army veteran, present for the liberation of Dachau, former US Marshal, known for violence, shows no remorse and denies his crimes, highly developed fantastical narratives, precludes facing the truths of his actions. Teddy angrily sets down the paper and demands to see his partner. Dr. Corley unveils a whiteboard, explaining that his name was an anagram for Andrew Latus, and that Rachel was an anagram for Dolores. The truth is, he was Andrew Latus, and he was the 67th patient. He was sentenced here on court order, and the crime he had committed was something that he could not forgive himself for. So he had to invent an identity for himself, that there was a conspiracy on the islands, so he can dismiss what everyone says about his crimes as lies. When Teddy insists that his name is Edward Daniels, Corley impatiently interrupts that he's been hearing the same narrative for the past 2 years and knows every detail. The missing patient 67, Rachel Solando, the storm, his missing partner. He sighs and explains that he wishes he could let him live out his fantasy of being the hero, but he is violent, trained, and the most dangerous patient that they've had. He's injured orderlies, guards, and other patients like George. He snaps at the doctor, asking why he would hurt George. The doctor quietly replies because George called him Latus, and he would do anything to not be Latus. The doctor then explains that the majority of the board had voted to take permanent measures, and that he must come to his senses, or else they will lobotomize him. Teddy once again angrily refuses to believe this, and then Chuck enters the room. He explains that he has been his primary psychiatrist, and his name was Dr. Lester Sheehan. Coley then explains that he swore before the Board of Overseers that he will attempt the most elaborate roleplay ever attempted in psychiatry to bring him back, and that if they play this out, Teddy will eventually realize how untrue and impossible this narrative is. Dr. Sheehan pleads with Teddy that if he does not come to his senses, everything they've done would have been for nothing. Teddy angrily picks up his gun from the table and exclaims that he knows that this one is real and loaded as his initials are carved onto it. He could tell from the exact weight, and there was a dent on the side of the barrel from the war. He shoots Corley, only to find him standing perfectly fine and realizes the gun was just a toy. Dr. Sheehan explains that Dolores was insane, suicidal, and delusional, and that it was her who set their city apartment on fire, forcing them to move to a lake house. This triggers Andrew to assault Dr. Sheehan out of anger, but Corley pulls out the photographs of his 3 dead children, Simon, Henry, and Rachel, the little girl he keeps dreaming about. Corley explains that his wife had drowned them at the cabin by the lake. When Teddy denies having any children, Dr. Corley pleads him to remember the little one that haunts his dreams every night, telling him that he should have saved her. Dolores appears and sadly says he shouldn't have come here, and that she had told him this will be the end of him. His daughter holds out her hand. The scene cuts to months ago of him coming home from work. He finds Dolores at the back of the house. Asking why Dolores is all wet, she kisses him. And when Andrew asks where the children are, Dolores tells him they're in school. As Andrew tells her that it's Saturday, he realizes the horrible event that has just taken place. He hurries to the lake, but it's too late. He could only wail in agony as he clings onto his children's lifeless bodies. After Andrew lays the children on the ground, Dolores tells Andrew that the children can be their living dolls, then abruptly cries out for Andrew to set her free. Andrew then shoots Dolores and breaks down in tears beside his dead family. After this intense flashback, Andrew passes out at the lighthouse. When he wakes up, he sees Rachel Solando to be a nurse. Sensing that Andrew has a better hold of reality, he tells Andrew that they've had a breakthrough once before, but he eventually regressed. He needs to tell them out loud what had happened. He sadly says that his name is Andrew Ladis, and he had murdered his wife because he couldn't take what had happened. He blames himself for not getting her treatment as he wanted to be with her. Afterwards, the scene cuts to Andrew sitting by some stairs at the entrance of the hospital. Dr. Sheehan sits behind Andrew and asks what's their next move. Andrew calls Dr. Sheehan Chuck, and that there was something fishy about the place and they need to get to the bottom of it. Dr. Sheehan sadly shakes his head. Collie turns his back against Andrew as the hospital staff takes Andrew away. Before he leaves, he asks Dr. Sheehan, what would be worse, to live as a monster or die as a good man? Dr. Sheehan calls out his name, but he doesn't turn back and willingly surrenders himself to the staff.